Hey friend, in this tutorial we are in week 4 of a 5-week series on building techniques upon techniques upon techniques. So we started with week 1 where we were talking just basically technique, wet on wet and wet on dry for watercolor, and then building more complex shapes and forms and volume and depth and all the things in the previous weeks. So now today we're on section 4 and we are going to be working on depth with a pine branch that has a fuzzy, blurry, foggy background of pine using wet on wet and then using wet on dry for a fun technique that shows a lot of distance, a lot of moodiness, a lot of foggy blurriness. And so this is an example of what you'll learn inside my book, Everyday Watercolor. I build every single day. It's a 30 paintings in 30 days book. And so every single day builds on the previous day's techniques to get a slightly more complex and obviously challenging you slightly more each time. And I also have a companion course coming out with the book as well next month. So check that out, linked below. But if you're ready to start painting this pine leaf situation, then let's dive in. So first things first is I'm starting with my 1.5 inch size mottler brush. This is from the Princeton Aqua Elite series. This is my favorite big coverage, big swash area brush. It holds a lot of water. It's a synthetic Klinsky sable hair brush. Holds a lot of pigment and water. And I'm just gonna start with kind of a lot of water, a little bit of pigment, kind of in this coffee consistency, tea to coffee consistency. So a lot more water. And I'm mixing up a kind of smoky blue with Prussian blue and Mars black or carbon black, and a little touch of green. I want this to feel really faded and really misty, so a little bit of black will help bring in that element of mystery or mistiness. And I'm bringing this down with a lot more water and not really adding any more pigment. And then what I like to do from there, once my wash is fully covered on my paper, I'll clean my brush off and just get it mostly dry, just a little damp, and just kind of sweep the wash from left to right or from bottom to top, and make sure that I'm getting rid of any excess water or pigment so there's no puddling or cauliflowers that will happen. Now I'm going to mix up a slightly darker value of that same bluish color, and using wet and wet technique and my size 16 round brush from Princeton Heritage 4050 series, I am going to paint in these misty, blurry pine needles. So just kind of using a vertical hold with my brush and quickly dashing these quick leaf shapes. Again, this is going to be the misty kind of foggy pine needles that are shown underneath the more crisp pine needles that we'll put on top using wet on dry technique. So my first layer is still wet and I'm just adding in some stems and with medium pressure adding in these leaf shapes, working from the tip of the leaf and back down. And the drier my base layer becomes, the more crisp or defined these shapes will become. And if my base layer is more wet and really, really puddly and wet, then it'll just become way too bloomy, way too messy. So you wanna make sure that your base layer isn't too crazy wet so that we can see these shapes, the leaf shapes, just as a little bit of a faded element. And so when I grab my mixture or my color, I'll usually dab any excess water off on my paper towel just to make sure that I'm not bringing any more excess water into my painting. And I'm just building on a slightly darker value and hue of this blue-green, smoky blue-green. So we have a few different values with these wet on wet pines. I'm just kind of placing all of these leaf clusters in the top right corner, peeking through the rest of the paper. But I want it to feel like we're walking through this misty, snowy forest of evergreen trees or whatever, and we have this tree that's poking in our view from the right side. And then while we wait for that to dry, I'm mixing up my thickest version of this same color, so black, blue, and sap green, Prussian blue, sap green, and carbon black to be exact, and a little bit of Kubrick green. and making this into a creamy consistency. So not too watery. And then I'm just gonna crisscross, overlap, and add depth with my size 16 brush and paint in these more defined pine needle shapes. Since it is using wet on dry technique, I will get these defined leaves and defined stems, and they won't blend or blur and get fuzzy because the base layer is dry. And so I've got more of a distinct shape in the foreground, and the fogginess and the misty layers beneath are more in the background or maybe covered by a thick layer of fog. And so this is highlighting section 4 of my book, Everyday Watercolor, of discussing depth and dimension. And this is something that I go into great detail, obviously, in my books, but also inside Everyday Watercolor Companion Course, which comes out January 1st, 2024. We are currently open for pre-order for the course. And if you are hearing this at the time of this coming out, we're in the month of December of 2023. And so we're celebrating Christmas and the launch of this course with a buy one, gift one deal for the course. So you could gift it to a friend who's maybe new to watercolor or wants to explore more about watercolor for free. Fun little Christmas gift idea. So I'm just repeating these steps for my pine needles. I love using a round brush for pine needle leaves because they're just really easy to do with this brush. Just use it on its side, and the natural shape of the brush will give you the shape of a pine needle. Obviously, the more pressure you apply to the brush, it's going to become more fat or a wider stroke or a wider leaf. So we're trying to keep the pressure pretty minimal to keep it thinner like these pine needles. And so we're covering and overlapping, crisscrossing, maybe switching up the values and hues of all of my stems and leaves here and there so that we have some movement and depth going on. But the more you add of these pine needles and these simple strokes, the more detailed the overall piece will feel. So just keep going with it. And just a few more pine needle details, adding a little bit more length from this corner. Since the underneath layer has a pretty long one coming out of this corner, I want to also extend my wet and dry, darker pine needle details out there as well. And then I'm gonna splatter some white gouache for some snow. Such a fun, easy watercolor painting to do. Great for all ages. I think it would be so much fun to do this with kids as well. But have fun with it. The wet and wet layers are so much fun, and then wet on dry, and I love using a good splatter. I hope you loved that video. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you stay tuned, come back here this time next week when we're gonna be wrapping up our 5-week series on these techniques, everyday watercolor techniques that I show in my book and also in my companion course that's launching next month. So make sure you check back. We're gonna be doing a really cool, fun landscape to tie it all together. Comment below with what your favorite part from today was, or what your favorite little nugget that you learned was. And as always, thank you so much for watching these videos. I hope you check out my book, Everyday Watercolor, and also see you in the companion course coming out January 2024. It's going to be awesome. I'll see you in the next video.